Hello and welcome back to another installment of Climate Hangouts. My name's James and we are coming to you live from Paris here in the Climate Generator Space, otherwise known as the Green Zone, next to the official negotiations themselves. I have with me Kaya from the Aotearoa Youth Leadership Institute. How are you doing today, Kaya?
Doing pretty good. It's been a bit of a long day. It's been a long last 4 days, but yeah, pretty good today.
Okay,
yeah.
Great. Now I understand there is a theme at the negotiations today. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
So today at the Indigenous Pavilion, it is Pacific Day. So for the last week, they've been doing a Indigenous region gets their very own day, and today it is the Pacific. Yep.
Okay. And as New Zealanders, Pacific issues are very important to us. So
you're a New Zealander. I'm a Pacific Islander, so yes, Pacific issues are very close to home.
For those of us watching back home in New Zealand, what can we do, or what should we be doing about Pacific issues in a climate change context?
Well, there's a lot that can be done. I think a lot of it is community mobilization around grassroots efforts to help combat and mitigate climate change impacts, especially within our own Pacific communities. We are still having some issues with, well, especially on the ground in New Zealand, we kind of have two issues. Either people don't fully understand climate change, or that they think that it's a secondary issue for our New Zealand-based communities, that they have more pressing issues like housing or education, and so it's just a secondary issue for them. Yeah.
Okay. And this is something you've studied as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I've spent a lot of years studying this. So I'm a Auckland Uni alumni / current student because I decided to do postgrad. But my undergraduate degree was in Civic Studies, and also I did a conjoint. And I'm currently doing my LLM in environmental law, where my research predominantly focuses on the legal impacts and implications that climate change is going to be having on Pacific communities and the Pacific region as a whole. Yeah.
And what's your interpretation of the developments here at the conference? Any key takeaway points?
Yeah, so things so far have been very, very interesting, especially coming out of Lima last year, where we saw the AOSIS negotiation line fracture, and even the Pacific negotiation, like the SIDS negotiation within the Pacific, completely fracture as to what they wanted. The Pacific leaders on Leaders' Day, their speeches were pretty much unanimous in terms of their asks. The clear messages are 1.5 degrees, so they're asking leaders to have an agreement that will be 1.5 degrees or lower as a emissions target, which they firmly established earlier in the year in the Suva Declaration. The second ask has been for a strong standalone loss and damage mechanism to deal with the issues around adaptation and mitigation, to deal with the issues of climate change that are already happening within Pacific communities. And the third very strong ask that have come out of this has been a very strong ask for a legally binding agreement. So 1.5, loss and damage, and legally binding are the three major asks of all the Pacific Island states that are here in Paris.
And to provide some context around that, the current commitment targets that have been submitted here at the conference is putting the world on track for 2.7 degrees of global warming, which means that any low-lying states are at huge risk.
Yeah. Their estimates show that with anything that's above 1.5 degrees, so 2-degree rise, that's going to be the equivalent of anywhere between 20 centimeters to 1 meter of sea level rise. For a significant portion of Pacific countries, we have a number of them that their whole countries are only 1 to 4 meters above sea level, and then we have the wider portion that has large amounts of low-lying areas that are also within that 1 meter sea level rise. So you're going to see huge amounts of coastal erosion, inundation. In some countries, so for example, the Marshall Islands, a sea level rise of 20 centimeters will inundate 80% of the Majuro Atoll that will be underwater. So it's 1.5 degrees it is quite a lot, and it's a massive ask. Even 1.5 degrees, and we're still going to see huge impacts of climate change in the Pacific. But trying to get the other 130 odd leaders to agree to 1.5 degrees is going to be the challenge for the Pacific here.
And of course, what we're talking about now are measures to try and mitigate this global warming. Of course, another quite separate issue is looking at how countries can adapt to the effects of climate change. Earlier this week, John Key committed further funding to the Pacific Islands to help with adaptation. What do you make of that, Kaya?
So not only New Zealand, Australia also committed more funding towards the Pacific. New Zealand is saying 20 million over 4 years, and Australia is saying up to 1 billion over a 5-year period. The issue is the same issue that we've been having for so many years, is that the funding that they're contributing is not new and additional funding. It is funding that they're essentially relocating or reallocating from their current aid budget to the Pacific, which essentially means that money that would have gone on infrastructure, political frameworks, NGO, corporation, education frameworks, all of that is going to be put aside or not done in lieu of climate change or vice versa. So the problem is they're putting this money towards, this money they were always and already giving. So it's kind of their sneaky way of saying, oh look, we're doing stuff in the Pacific, we're giving X amount of money, but in actual fact it's not a huge amount of money, it's not a huge amount of time period, and it's not going to make a significant impact. Well, that's my interpretation of that. It's even more concerning, when we account for the fact that there's 22 Pacific Island countries and territories, about 15 of them are self-governing, which means you're spending $1.2 billion between 15 countries. That is not a lot of money. When you put it into context against things like one seawall around the Marshall Islands, around Majuro, would be $100 million. So $1.2 million could pay for 12 seawalls anywhere in the Pacific. So yeah, it might sound like a lot of money, but it really, really isn't.
And one final issue to touch on. If we are unable to successfully mitigate climate change to safe levels, we have to take into account the fact that we will have forced migration on unprecedented levels.
Yeah, exactly.
What does that mean for the Pacific?
So Pacific people, we have always been very, we're people who move around a lot. We've always moved throughout the oceans from island to island, and it's only since colonization that we've been confined to, our islands essentially, with the implication or the addition of like nation states and boundaries. However, that very same concept of nation states is now undoing us, because our islands are either sinking or they're going to be rendered uninhabitable due to saltwater intrusion on our crops, on our soil, and even if a country doesn't have to move all its population, it's going to have to move a significant portion of it. In Fiji, they've already relocated 45 communities. There are another 830 which have already been earmarked for relocation. For other countries like Tuvalu, Kiribati, where the likelihood that their whole country might have to move, there have been a few issues considered. I came from a session earlier where the Tuvaluan Prime Minister, Inele Sopoaga, and the Kiribati President, Anote Tong, both spoke about this issue. And they were quite clear. Ideally, they don't want to move. However, it's becoming increasingly likely that they will have to. They've got strategies in place. Kiribati has been implementing what they call the migration with dignity approach, whereby they're upskilling their people to the extent that they can find, they can migrate on their skills that are needed by other countries, and that they can become meaningful members of their communities. In addition to that, they've also been exploring options with Japan, the Netherlands, China, and a few others on how to possibly reinforce their islands or build them up a couple of meters in order to kind of stave off displacement for another 30 to 40 years. Their final option, though, and probably one that they've both described as their most hopeful option, is the fact that Fiji has reiterated yet again that if it came to it, that they would be willing to take in migrants, displacees from both Kiribati and Tuvalu, which isn't without its issues. Fiji already has a significantly large population. Adding another 110,000 people from Tuvalu and Kiribati would be hard, but it would be feasible. Yeah, so there are options, but ideally they don't want to go.
And if it did come to it, do you think New Zealand should be taking the same approach as Fiji?
So I could probably give everyone out there my 15,000 word dissertation on this topic, but I'm not going to subject everyone to that. My personal feeling, my personal view is that I think New Zealand and Australia especially have not only a moral but a geopolitical interest slash, mandate in the area. They constantly are talking about their Pacific Island neighbors and how the Pacific is their backyard. If action comes, they're not actually doing it. So I'm definitely of the opinion that there should be the creation or the establishment of a climate-driven displacee migration category. Australia and New Zealand already have multiple migration pathways with various Pacific Island countries. One in New Zealand is like the Pacific Access category. They've got a horticultural seasonal workers program in Australia, whereby Pacific people, in very small numbers though, so like 75, 100, can go to Australia and New Zealand temporarily. However, as President Tong was saying earlier today, the programs aren't without their problems, and they actually see a large amount of people return, especially with the Pacific Access category. New Zealand actually goes 75. A large portion end up coming back to Kiribati because it's just not working. So definitely need a new migration system to deal with these people, rather than forcing them to become stateless and then trying to find their way under our current regime and international legal framework, which just doesn't deal with climate change displacees.
Okay, well, Kaya, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts.
I hope I haven't bored all of New Zealand.
Not at all, not at all. And I think you've underlined the seriousness of the issues on the table here in Paris, and what people experiencing climate change on the front lines, as it were, could be subject to if we don't get an ambitious and binding agreement in place over the next few weeks. So thank you again, and we've just heard from Kaya of the Aotearoa Youth Leadership Institute. Thanks again for tuning in, and see you tomorrow night on Climate Hangouts.